The room went still when steel flashed inches away, close enough to breathe fear. Everyone expected blood, shouting, panic, but Bumpy Johnson's world answered violence with silence, and that silence carried weight. The room was narrow, built for conversations that were never meant to last long. A back room tucked behind a Harlem storefront, lit by a single hanging bulb that hummed softly, as if even the light understood the rules. Men stood close enough to feel one another breathe. Coats brushed shoulders. No one moved more than they had to. The insult was quiet. Almost casual. The kind spoken by someone who thought proximity made him untouchable. For a second, nothing happened. Then steel caught the light. The blade didn't swing. It didn't rush. It appeared the way decisions appear, sudden, final, deliberate. Close quarters meant there was nowhere to step back, nowhere to pretend distance existed. The edge hovered inches from flesh, steady as a held breath. Every man in the room assumed the same ending. Blood on the floor. Shouts. Chairs overturned. That was how moments like this were supposed to resolve themselves. Violence was expected. It always was. But the hand holding the blade did not shake. It belonged to one of Bumpy Johnson's men, chosen not for temper, but for restraint. His face was calm. Almost bored. As if the blade were merely punctuation, not a sentence. No one reached for a weapon. No one spoke. Fear tightened its grip, but it found nothing to push against. The silence grew dense, pressing in on the walls, heavier than any threat could be. The man facing the blade realized too late what he had misjudged. This wasn't a test of speed or strength. It was a lesson in control. And control did not announce itself. Somewhere nearby, close enough to matter, far enough to remain unseen, Bumpy Johnson was listening. He didn't need to enter the room. The moment already belonged to him. The blade stayed raised. The silence held. And in that pause, everything began to change. Harlem did not announce authority with sirens or speeches. It lived in routines. In the way doors stayed open for some and closed for others. In the way names were spoken softly, or not at all. Bumpy Johnson understood this better than anyone because he built it patiently. He walked the streets without hurry, greeting people as neighbors, not subjects. Shopkeepers trusted him because disputes ended before they turned ugly. Mothers trusted him because children came home. Men trusted him because lines were clear and kept. No one needed reminding. Memory handled that work. When trouble pressed in from outside, Harlem adjusted without commands. Barbers slowed their hands. Card games paused mid-shuffle. Men on stoops straightened, not to threaten, but to be seen. Presence mattered more than muscle here. Everyone knew who protected the balance. Bumpy never gathered crowds to prove strength. He listened. He waited. He corrected quietly. Power, to him, was stewardship. You held it so others could live without fear. That made loyalty feel natural, not forced. Inside the back room, the drawn blade was not an accident. It was an extension of the order Harlem already recognized. The man holding it carried years of understanding on his wrist. He knew when to stop. He knew when silence was enough. Bumpy's authority reached rooms he did not enter. That was the difference. Men behaved as if he were present because his standards were. Respect had become habit. Habit became law. Outside, the street breathed evenly. No rush of footsteps. No gathering crowd. Harlem trusted the pause. It trusted that noise would only weaken the lesson. This was the city Bumpy shaped, a place where restraint traveled faster than fear, where control arrived before chaos, and where even violence waited for permission. He learned early that shouting invited challenge, while calm closed doors gently. Each choice accumulated, favor by favor, correction by correction, until the neighborhood mirrored his values. Outsiders mistook the quiet for weakness. They missed the network of glances, favors, and obligations woven through blocks. In Harlem, consequences did not hurry, but they arrived together. That shared timing made resistance feel pointless. The room with the blade was only one node in a larger design. Bumpy trusted the design. It had never failed him. History would later blur details, but the effect remained precise. People acted differently after. Voices softened. Tests stopped coming. Order felt normal again, and normality protected everyone. That was the real authority, a community choosing calm because it worked, because it lasted, because it kept their streets intact without begging or breaking anyone. The insult did not rise from courage. It came from pressure. From a man pushed forward by others who wanted to see how far they could go without paying for it. Close quarters were chosen for a reason. Proximity was supposed to shrink authority, make restraint look like hesitation. The room had been selected carefully. No windows. No witnesses who mattered. A place where tempers were expected to solve problems faster than judgment. Whoever spoke the line believed that nearness erased consequence. He believed silence meant uncertainty. He was wrong. Pressure works quietly, the same way respect does. It builds long before it shows itself. The men who sent him knew Bumpy Johnson's reputation. They also knew reputation invites testing. Someone always wants to be the one who proves the old rules don't apply anymore. So they leaned on the smallest piece. A remark meant to sting. A word placed just right. The hope was simple: provoke a reaction, force a mistake, make the story about violence instead of control. But pressure reveals more about the hand applying it than the one receiving it. As the second stretched, the man who spoke began to understand the shape of his mistake. The blade hadn't appeared because of anger. It appeared because the room itself rejected what he'd said. The silence around him was not confusion, it was judgment. He searched faces for support and found none. No nods. No shared outrage. Only stillness. That was the moment the pressure shifted. What had been applied to Bumpy's world now settled squarely on his chest. This wasn't about him anymore. It never had been. He was a message that arrived too loudly. The blade stayed raised, but the real force was invisible. It was the awareness that he stood alone in a place governed by rules he did not write and did not fully understand. Close quarters didn't protect him. They trapped him inside the consequences. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city held steady. Harlem did not need to be told when to lean in. It recognized imbalance instinctively. The insult had crossed a line that existed long before this night, drawn not in ink or blood, but in agreement. Bumpy Johnson allowed moments like this to breathe because pressure exposed intent. Anyone could threaten. Few could hold back. That difference separated those who ruled briefly from those who endured. The man with the blade knew when to stop because he knew who he served. He was not there to win. He was there to remind. The insult lost its power in the pause that followed. Words always did when they met silence disciplined enough to outlast them. By the time the pressure finished its work, the outcome no longer required explanation. The room had already chosen. The blade stayed where it was, suspended in a narrow space between intention and consequence. No one counted the seconds, but everyone felt them. Time slowed in rooms like this. It always did when violence was expected and denied. Close quarters stripped away performance. There was no room for grand gestures, no space to retreat into bravado. Every breath sounded louder than it should have. Every shift of weight felt exposed. The man facing the blade understood now that movement itself had become dangerous. Stillness was the only shelter left. The others in the room watched without expression. Not because they lacked feeling, but because feeling had learned to wait. They knew what this pause meant. It wasn't mercy. It wasn't indecision. It was assessment. Harlem's way of measuring whether someone deserved to leave unchanged. The blade's edge reflected the hanging bulb in thin, broken lines. Light fractured there, refusing to settle. The hand holding it remained steady, elbow relaxed, wrist loose. This wasn't a warning driven by anger. It was a boundary made visible. The man who had spoken first felt the room turn against him. Not aggressively. Quietly. The kind of shift that offered no argument. He realized then that shouting would not save him. Apologies would not move the blade. Promises meant nothing in a place where memory outlived words. He searched for Bumpy Johnson and did not see him. That absence carried its own pressure. Bumpy's presence was not required for his authority to operate. That truth pressed harder than the steel ever could. Close quarters became a lesson in inevitability. The outcome had already been chosen the moment the insult crossed into shared space. Everything after was ritual. Necessary, but already decided. No one intervened. No one needed to. The blade did not advance because it didn't have to. The silence accomplished what violence was supposed to do, without cost, without chaos. At last, the blade lowered. Slowly. Without flourish. The motion felt final, not because something ended, but because something had been set permanently in place. Breath returned to the room in careful measures. The hanging bulb continued its soft hum. Chairs remained upright. Nothing looked different, yet nothing would ever feel the same. Those who witnessed the moment carried it with them. Not as a story to tell loudly, but as a reminder held close. Close quarters taught them something that night: power did not need to strike to be understood. And when the room finally loosened its grip, everyone knew the silence had done its work. Bumpy Johnson entered the moment without stepping into the room. He didn't need to. The silence already carried his weight, settling into corners, resting on shoulders, claiming space that noise never could. When the blade lowered, it wasn't relief that followed. It was recognition. Everyone present understood what had just been demonstrated. Authority had arrived without force, and force had quietly surrendered. Bumpy's voice came from nearby, low and measured, not raised enough to command attention, yet impossible to ignore. He did not repeat the insult. He did not address it directly. He spoke instead about order. About rooms like this staying intact. About people leaving them able to return home. The words were few. They did not threaten. They did not explain. They landed because the room had already agreed to receive them. Bumpy understood something many men never learned: power gained through reaction was fragile. Power held through stillness endured. He allowed the silence to finish the work, then closed the moment gently, like a door that would not be reopened. The man who had been tested did not speak. He did not need to. He had been answered completely. The blade, now gone from view, had served its purpose without ever touching skin. That restraint mattered more than blood ever could. Bumpy moved past the doorway briefly, visible just long enough to be remembered. His posture was relaxed. His face unreadable. He offered no glance of triumph. Victory did not interest him. Stability did. The men who stood there felt smaller, not because they had been humiliated, but because they had been measured. And found wanting. That difference stayed with them. Bumpy did not linger. He trusted the aftermath. He trusted that silence would travel farther than any warning shouted across a room. The lesson was already spreading, carried by posture, by lowered voices, by the way people would speak about this night without ever describing it. In Harlem, reputation was not built on spectacle. It was built on moments like this, where nothing happened, and everything changed. As Bumpy left, the room resumed breathing. Life continued. But something fundamental had shifted. A boundary had been reinforced without violence, without panic, without loss of control. That was domination as Bumpy understood it. Calm. Precise. Final. The room returned to its shape slowly. Not all at once. Chairs were adjusted. Coats were straightened. Men avoided each other's eyes without needing to explain why. No one spoke about what had almost happened. Harlem never wasted breath on near misses. What mattered was what remained. Outside, the street carried on as if nothing had shifted. That was the measure of success. No sirens. No gathering crowd. No ripple of panic. Order had held, and because it held, life continued uninterrupted. That continuity was Bumpy Johnson's real legacy. Word still traveled, but it traveled the right way. Quietly. Carefully. Without exaggeration. People didn't say a blade was pulled. They said a line was crossed and then restored. They said the room went silent. They said that was enough. The man who had spoken out of turn carried the lesson longer than anyone else. He didn't become smaller in public. He became quieter. And in Harlem, quiet men lasted longer than loud ones. Bumpy never followed up. He didn't need to. The absence of further consequence was itself a message. Mercy, when paired with certainty, created loyalty. Fear alone never could. Years later, details would blur. People would argue about where it happened, who was present, how close the blade really was. Those details didn't matter. The silence did. Silence had rewritten the rules in that space and then moved on. That was how Bumpy Johnson shaped his world. Not through repeated displays of force, but through moments that didn't need repeating. One lesson, clearly delivered, carried forward by memory and respect. Harlem remembered because Harlem had been protected. And protection earned agreement. Agreement built legacy. When people spoke of Bumpy after that, they didn't talk about violence. They talked about control. About how things stayed standing. About how chaos always seemed to stop before it reached their door. The blade had been drawn. It had not fallen. And in that restraint, a city learned again what power looked like when it chose to last.